I'm Doug Thompson. Welcome to this edition of Legislative Updates with John Barker of the Kansas House of Representatives for the 70th District. Most of us get our information concerning the actions of the Kansas legislature either from some form of media or after the fact, as the legislation either became law or died during the process. Representative John Barker has graciously agreed to take time from his schedule to update pending legislation as the bills are moving through committee to consideration by the House of Representatives. Right after this short break, let's talk with Representative John Barker concerning this week in the Kansas legislature. Welcome to Legislative Updates. My name is Doug Thompson. I have my guest, John Barker, with me from the legislature. And John, you have brought up somebody with you today. Who's our special guest?
I brought up Dan Hawkins, the representative from the 100th District here in Kansas, Sedgwick County, and he's chairman of Health and Human Services in the House. And Dan, welcome.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Dan, let's see, your territory would be the west side of Wichita?
West side of Wichita, basically out around Mays Road to Tyler, and then over to Ridge Road north, Maple Street south to 37, or Maple on the south, 37th Street on the north.
All right,
Yep.
Okay, thank you. And this is your third term in the legislature?
Be my third term. I came in the same time John came in.
Yeah, I was going to say both of you are in your third term now. John, this is Legislative Updates, of course. We've had two shows that have been out, and the feedback's been very positive. People appreciate it, that they're getting information. You guys are on your way back home for the weekend from the legislature, so we're getting hot off the press.
Yeah.
What's going on now?
Well, we've had a busy week. I know I have. As chair of Fed and State, I had hearings on my gaming bill. On Monday, we had the opponents. On Tuesday, we had the proponents. We were, after an hour and a half debate, on Wednesday, we got the bill kicked out or out to the floor of the House. We're optimistic at this point. There is some opposition from the state casinos, of course. They don't want to share the wealth. But hopefully within the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll get it on the floor of the House. And at some point in time, if we're lucky, we will have horse and dog racing back in the state of Kansas, which would be very beneficial to Dickinson County.
Yeah, you know, we've talked about that before, that the Greyhound Hall of Fame,
Right.
located in Abilene,
Right.
and that's a pretty tough one when there's no dog racing going on, that's betting goes on. And
Right.
this would create, I remember you telling us before, that it would create a lot of jobs.
Like 4,500 jobs in the state. About 600 of those jobs would be down southeast Kansas, down around Frontenac and Eureka, and 400 if we went back to the levels that we had in 93, 94 here in Dickinson County.
Yeah, that's a lot of jobs.
That's a lot of jobs. That's a lot of jobs. Other than that, I've been with my chairman. He's chairman of the Health and Human Services. I serve on that committee. We've had Medicaid expansion hearings on 2 days this week. We had the opponents on one day and the proponents on the not the next day, but the following day. It was interesting. I had a constituent come up to me as I was leaving after the proponents, which are the folks that want the bill passed, had asked me, he said, well, where are you at? And I said, well, I don't know. I've still got questions to ask. And she said, you need to be for it. But I had not heard from the opponents yet. You know, we have ideologues out there that just give them an issue. They're either for or against it without knowing what the content is or what the information is and what it could cost the state of Kansas. So, you know, I waited till the second day to evaluate the opponents to the bill, and I'm still considering the bill and looking at what it would cost the state. And Dan will be able to answer those questions for us a little later.
Oh, that's great. It's great. You know, I read in the paper, just like most of the people who are watching the show, that there's budget shortfalls, $350 million this year, and then there's concerns over the school funding.
Right.
And then the paper says that there's budget shortfalls predicted for next year, $1.1 billion.
Right.
That accurate? Or?
It is probably accurate. Remember, we have consensus estimates. When we have experts come in to tell us what they think the revenues will be the following year. Of course, they're trying to predict the future. And they base it upon historical data. What normally after a great recession like we had a few years ago, what the recovery normally is. It's normally about 3.5%. So they programmed those consensus estimates based upon that. Well, the economy only grew the last couple of years like 1%. So the revenues were short. We're looking at a number of fixes. One of them, of course, the Senate had this week. We're going to debate a cut in education. The Senate indicated they were going to work all day yesterday. They went in for a half hour and went home. Hopefully they will come back next week. We passed a tax plan out yesterday. I don't know if it's a great tax plan. I would probably vote against it at this point, but it starts the process. And that's what we're looking at.
Yeah.
And I think the House will take the lead here.
Okay. All right. And what else is you have updates for anything else you've been on this?
I have next week. I'm working some of the gun bills, as far as hospitals and nursing homes and mental health centers.
They would be excluded from the requirement?
They would be excluded from the requirement.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll get that out and work it on the floor of the House maybe the following week.
You got a lot going on.
I do.
There's a lot going on up in the legislature. Most people don't have a clue what all takes place there. And I hear this one a lot, just like you guys do. They say, well, what are you going to do about the shortfall? And when somebody tells me that, I oftentimes say, well, where do you think the money comes from? You know, it's coming from the taxpayers. Yeah. So we can do something about it.
And less than 50% of the people pay the taxes.
Yeah. We're going to cut away. We'll take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legislative Updates with John Barker and Dan Hawkins. And Dan, I think we're shifting over to you now because we're moving into Medicaid. Is that right?
That is right.
And that's a complicated one, so I guess John's brought you up so that you can take us through this.
Yeah, we've had a week of Medicaid expansion hearings this week,
Yeah,
so
we
it's
have.
been a busy week.
And well, tell them about Medicaid expansion in
Well,
the state of Kansas.
You know, I think probably one of the most important things to realize about Medicaid expansion is that there's a whole population out there that we're already serving. And a lot of people don't think about who we're serving. They're just thinking about the people that would be added during this expansion phase. So I think it's a good thing for people to realize that our current Medicaid expansion population is made up of 13 different segments or populations. Pregnant women, mothers after 1 year of birth, children whose family incomes are up to 250% of the poverty level, parents with children up to 38% of the poverty level, physically disabled people, people with traumatic brain injuries, developmentally disabled. There's just 13 different segments of that population. And so those people are already being served by Medicaid, or what we call CanCare here in Kansas. Medicaid expansion would bring 150,000 people, and actually that is Kansas Health Institute's estimate of what it would be. KDHE, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, estimate it could be as high as 180,000.
More people?
More people to be brought in. So currently, we're at about 450,000 in our Medicaid population. This would increase the population by 40%.
So this would take about 20% of the people?
This
Is that about what it would come up to?
it would actually, that's absolutely right. About 20% of our population at that point would be on Medicaid.
What's the projected expenses on this? Because it's got to be expensive.
Well, it is expensive, and that's one of the really points of contention between those who really want Medicaid expansion and those who are really taking pause and looking at the cost. There's a coalition out there that have really pushed Medicaid expansion, and they're saying that this is all budget neutral, that it will be taken care of in certain ways. Our KHI, Kansas Health Institute, just put out a report, and the Kansas Department of Health and Environment also have put out a report. They're fairly close in nature. There's a little bit of differences, but fairly close in their numbers. And the cost of Medicaid expansion estimated on that 180,000 is, in the first full year, $77 million to the state of Kansas that we would have to pay. And that would rise to a point of about 100 million. And that's assuming everything went correct. That's assuming that their projections were right. What we're seeing across the states who have expanded is they've woefully underestimated how many people would be served and the cost of those, and the projections just go out of sight.
And other states have been through this same scenario, had projections. How did those projections come out in those situations?
You know, probably the worst was Colorado, our neighbor to the west. They missed their projected enrollment by 207%. We had some states that have only missed it by 30%. But what's really an interesting figure of all states who have expanded Medicaid, on average, it's been 110% higher than what they thought their maximum enrollment would be.
What's the theory behind the expansions? Why?
The theory behind the expansion is there's these 150,000 people who are able-bodied adults under 138% of the poverty level that currently cannot participate in Medicaid. So if you're under 38% or over 100%, and with expansion to go to 138%, you can't participate. This would bring all of those people really from 0 to 138%, age 19 to 64, into this population and give them free health care. No cost to them.
Well, let me ask you this, Dan. How does this work for the person who's working a 40-hour job and not making a whole lot of money at it, but the insurance is part of it coming out of his salary, part of it coming out of the employer's benefits, and the guy right next to him working similar hours, maybe not making quite as much, gets the free health insurance? Is that a reasonable scenario that I'm telling you?
It is possible. Generally, what we see is that if you are, if currently the way the law is right now, if you're working a minimum wage job, let's say $7.25 an hour for 32 hours a week, then you make enough that you would actually be able to go on to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and go onto the exchange and get a subsidy to where it would only really cost you $20 a month for your health care. This law would make it to where those people would be forced out of that situation and would be on Medicaid, and we would pay for all of their costs.
Even the $20?
Even the $20.
Where's the money come from?
You and me. There is no free lunch here. So that $77 million that we would pay the first year, that comes from you and me. That comes from the taxpayers of Kansas. We have to foot that bill if we pass Medicaid expansion.
But then also the federal government has some matching money at this time.
Yeah, currently the way the law is in 2017, actually from 14 to 17, the federal government paid 100% of the new expansion population. So if you were in that new expansion population, they paid 100%. If you had been eligible for Medicaid in the last many years and had never taken it, and then decided to come on, the state was required to pay 45% of that. The federal government would pay 55%. And this is the situation we're really in right now. We know that the federal government has changed. We have a new president, and that president has said that he's going to do away with the Affordable Care Act. And the Medicaid expansion is a part of the Affordable Care Act. It's truly a part of that. And so if they do away with that, they do away with that enhanced match and take it down to what we call FMAP, which is our current Medicaid match. Our costs would go from $77 million a year to $464 million a year state share. That's a 20% increase in your taxes to pay for that.
Dan, we're going to have to take a break because that's all I can absorb right now. So we're going to be on break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legislative Updates. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my guests, John Barker and Dan Hawkins, both from the House of Representatives for the state of Kansas. Dan, you're from the 100th District, which is the west side of Wichita, and John, you're the 70th District, which is in the area, of course, where we're filming from right now, in the Chapman area and other areas. Dan, let's go back to this expense on this Medicare. I'm having a little trouble absorbing this here. I mean, what happens to the guy that says, I'm just going to go off of my plan and get on to this thing? Is that possible?
And that is entirely possible in two different ways. You may have somebody that had individual health insurance, and that person goes on to the Affordable Care Act's marketplace, and due to how much he makes, it says you're no longer going to be on your health insurance. You have to go on Medicaid because that's where you qualify for. So it's not do you want to? They're forced off of their coverage onto Medicaid because of the application process, and it shows that their income is low enough. It forces them into that.
And that's what they're paying for. They're paying for their private insurance, and they're going to force them off the private insurance onto the free insurance.
But in addition, it can also happen, you could have people who are working for an employer that provides health coverage, and with the advent of the Medicaid expansion, it could force them off of their employer health coverage, where it's being paid for and predominantly subsidized by the employer, into Medicaid, to where you and I are paying that cost.
Well, why wouldn't the employer want to force them off of there and save the expense?
And for the employer, that would be a good deal. For us, it's not a good deal.
Yeah, and so when we talk about the federal is going to come in and pay this or not pay a certain fund, that's the same taxpayers.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Doesn't
Okay.
matter whether it's state tax or federal tax, it's still us paying the bill, isn't it?
So what are you going to do, Dan?
Well, you know, we've got a situation right now where we've had the hearings. We have to evaluate, just like Representative Barker said, we have to evaluate the pros and cons. And I hope that the representatives who are on the committee look at the whole picture and evaluate whether we can really afford this. And truly, it's not that you don't want to help people. We do have safety net clinics out there that do provide that safety net for people in those situations, and they do a wonderful job. You wouldn't believe some of the things that's being done out there. But this truly is going to be a budget buster. It's going to break the bank. In fact, in many states where it's already been done, we're seeing the effects right now. For instance, in Washington, the state of Washington has ran $2.3 billion over budget in their first 18 months. Ohio, I believe Ohio is $4.2 billion over budget in their first 2.5 years. Kentucky's run $3.3 billion over in 2.5 years. In Illinois, a fairly close neighbor for us, $1.9 billion over in their first 2 years. So we're seeing that over and over. New Mexico, they came out with a budget deficit in their Medicaid about $411 million for this next year. And so we're seeing it state after state after state that has expanded, that it's really busting the budget. So why wouldn't we learn from other states and say, you know something, can we really afford to go down that road? What if it, we're expecting 77 million. What if it goes 200 million in our first year? How are we going to deal with that? We're 350 million in the hole right now for our current fiscal year. Let's throw another 100 million or 200 million on top of that. That's going to be a difficult proposition.
And we're still waiting for school finance to come out.
School finance still hasn't been figured or factored into that whole equation.
So what do you project that President Trump's going to do to try to clean this mess up? Because it appears he certainly has inherited this mess.
Yeah. You know, I think that clarity would help us out a whole lot. And that's one of the things that we would like to see, is we would like to pause and say, you know something, it would be better off for us to have some clarity from the federal government of what's going to happen. There's some good ideas that are coming out of the federal government right now. Senator Collins has an idea for block grants. I know Speaker Ryan has a plan. There's been several plans that are being floated out there. All of them involve the states coming up with a plan to take care of this versus a one-size-fits-all federal plan.
So the federal would shift it back over to the states, come up with a plan that worked for them.
And what's key for that to happen is for regulations from CMS. CMS, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, is the federal bureaucracy that really tells us how we have to operate. And they don't give us a whole lot of latitude. So we can't really come up with sometimes some really great cost-saving measures and some ideas for some better outcomes. They really say you have to do it like this. So if we can get some relief from that point, and also like a block grant from the federal government for us to run our own system, I think truly we can make some great gains in this and save some dollars.
Okay, all right. Got a question for each of you here, both of you. I hear about medical marijuana or recreational marijuana working its way through. What is it? Or at least coming up for consideration?
Well, there was a bill introduced by a member of our health, Representative Wilson out of Douglas County, Lawrence. We've not had a hearing on it. Mr. Chairman, are we going to have a hearing on it?
Now, we've actually have a couple of bills. Right. We have the bill, which is a CBD oil bill for seizure disorders for children, and that came from Representative Wilson. That one we have kind of put off just a little bit to see what else happens here. We also had introduced a medical marijuana bill. The problem was that it wasn't introduced until late. It actually did not, it was not read into the House until this morning. Right. And so it's just now going to hit my committee, and literally next week is my last week for committee. And so next week's calendar is already full. There's really no place for it. So it's going to be hard for that to really be heard this year.
Okay, time for us to take another break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Legislative Updates. I'm your host, Doug Thompson, with my guest, Representative JohnBarker from the 70th District, Dan Hawkins from the 100th District. John, what have you got going next week?
Oh, we've got a number of things. There's going to be a hearing on the death penalty, repealing the death penalty. I have one I think I mentioned earlier about the guns. We've got a number of alcohol bills. I know Dan's committee's got a number of things. We're full next week. We'll be on the floor of the House trying to pass a few things on general orders. So it'll be another busy week. I know the tax committee passed out a tax plan that will have to be looked at by all the members. I hope the Senate comes back at some point in time next week and does their job. But we're taking the lead. I'm glad to have Dan down here today. In the future, I've got a few other people lined up. I'd like to bring the Speaker of the House of Representatives to come in and visit with you also.
I would love that. It's been so informative to have Dan come in, and with you all, of course. Always right. It's informative.
But we're going to have a number of guests over the next few weeks or tapings of these shows, and I am trying to divide it up and maybe possibly have the tax chair in. Us chairmen kind of stick together. So but I'd like to have a speaker and maybe the tax chair, maybe the appropriations chair, or a chair of another committee, just to get a wide variety of all the different issues.
Does it feel like that the legislature is on time right now to where you want to be, need to be, to wrap up the session in the time frame you've got to deal with?
I think the House is. I'm not sure where the Senate's at, since they took off yesterday while we worked all day. But yeah, we're moving along. We've got the turnaround next week. Last week of hearing bills, we'll be on the floor on the week of the week of the 20th all day, working bills that have come out of committees, and then we'll take a break and come back.
If you want to stay current with the legislative updates, you keep watching Legislative Updates on Eagle. Thank you. See you next time. Hope you have enjoyed this segment of Legislative Updates with John Barker. I'm Doug Thompson with special guest John Barker. Tune in next time for another legislative update. Thanks for watching.